think we're live now. I think we're live, but I'm not seeing anything happen yet. So let's do this little dance, for not a literal dance, but let's just give it a moment, and then I've a horrible feeling that the first couple of seconds is going to be. Oh, it is. It's just us. It's just me.
Just looking confused.
All right. In which case, oh, there we are. I'll mute myself as I promised I would. Okay. Right. Now, full start done. Thanks everyone for everyone. We're in double figures, Dave. Jack, we're in double figures, and I imagine that 3 of them are us. But
it's downhill from here.
Reached double figures, and the chat is happening. Timothy and Nick are chatting away. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. This is weird. This is like a Zoom call that we decided to publish. And let's see how it goes. I'm pressing buttons that I've never pressed before, playing with tools we've never played before, and it's very much me just showing how ignorant I am, not just about YouTube Live, but also about ways to build stuff for the web. So so thank you, Dave and Jack, for joining me for a chat. I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself properly in just a moment, but I thought before I did, as you wait patiently, I'm going to show this. So why are we here? Well, Twitter has instigated a conversation, and sometimes it's better to take the conversation to a medium where you can actually hear each other. But Alex said this the other day. He was talking a little bit about different surveys that happen on the web about trends in web development, and he observed quite fairly that the Jamstack survey that Netlify put out each year didn't reference lit or fast UI, or I don't think there's too much mention of web components, which is a bit of an omission. It's certainly not intentional, but it's an interesting observation nonetheless. And so I confess that I don't really know too much about web components. I know a little, but not enough, and not enough to feel confident in using them. And the conversation went on, and then Dave kind of cheerfully piped up with saying, we should chat about it. And then, a few moments later, Jack pipes up as well with opinions. So he's going to bring some opinions as well. So on the basis of seeing that and a few other bits of conversation and chatter that happened off the back of that, we thought, why not? Why don't we actually have a conversation and record it? Because that's what the nice folks at Lit were also saying. Well, maybe you should just do that and publish it, and then the information goes further than just into your head, Philip. And so that's what this is. So shall we start, Dave? Since you're the one who first piped up and said, "Well, I've got thoughts." So Dave, who are you? and where are you using web components at the moment? Why don't we start there?
I recall I am Dave. I remember now. I'm Dave. I work at Nordhealth. I'm a front-end developer. I work on the design system. So the design system is our source of truth for the front end, and part of that source of truth is a component system that is built in web components, and we build those web components using Lit, which is a framework for helping us. Is it framework? For a library. There we go. Check. Save myself. It's a library to help us build web components, and those web components get used in all sorts of different applications and websites and all of that kind of stuff. So that is my job.
Nice. Okay. Well, we'll get into some of your experiences there and why maybe web components have been chosen for that, and some of the advantages, or just the experiences you've had in a second. But why don't we also give Jack a chance to do likewise? Jack, who are you, and what are you doing with web components?
Thanks. Hey everyone. So my name is Jack. I currently work at Google on the Chrome DevTools team, which I'm hopeful 1 or 2 people might have used, or at least heard of once or twice. And we use web components really to drive all new UI for any new parts of DevTools. So in particular, we've launched a couple of new panels recently. They're almost exclusively powered by web components with a bit of lit HTML, not full lit. We can talk more about that later on. And also we're kind of working on migrating a lot of older DevTools code to use web components as well. So we've kind of, about 2 years ago, picked web components as the the sort of solution for our problems, and we've been using it pretty full on ever since.
Nice, cool. It sounds to me like two fairly different use cases there. Like Jack, you're building a product, and admittedly that product lives in the browser, but it's still a product that you're kind of shaping to exactly what you need it to do. And then Dave, you're building a set of components that could be used in all kinds of things. So so really trying to make it kind of agnostic, so it could live all over the place. I guess. So okay, so here's my confession. I've never once built a web component. I feel like I've got a passing familiarity with them, but I don't really know the ins and outs of it. And I think my hesitancy in using them is I'm nervous about doing something that feels like it introduces JavaScript as something that is a blocking detail before something can render. So I've been thinking, oh, this is adding more bottlenecks and complexity. So I've kind of stood back. However, of course, I guess it depends on what you're building. If you're going to be building something that you would be reaching for some other big, very heavy JavaScript framework, then maybe this is more palatable. But I guess it always depends on what you're making. But can either of you kind of put me at ease a little bit about how responsible I would be being as a web developer by introducing web components into something I'm building? I mean, how have you both kind of thought about that kind of stuff? Can we talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Jack go first.
Oh no. Okay. So yeah, I think the first sort of thing to say explicitly is that at least I don't think any of us, or myself and Dave, are here to convince everyone to drop everything and use web components from tomorrow. I think, as you say, Phil, it's very much depends on the context and what you're building and the problems you have to solve. And you're right, there is a JavaScript dependency on web components. And certainly if you weren't reaching for any other JavaScript, it would be weird to reach for web components and JavaScript just because you wanted to use them. So there's certainly a time and a place. I think certainly there's much more interesting discussion to be had if you're thinking, I'm building a project that is going to need something like React, Vue, any of those frameworks. But instead you could consider using web components. And I think that's interesting. A lot of people are not scared of them, but unfamiliar with them because they've changed a lot over the years. And there was a whole custom elements, it's called the V0 spec, which has been and gone. It was in Chrome for a while. They have now stabilized a lot. And I think they're very powerful. The cross-browser support is good. And in terms of responsibility, I think it's a really interesting question, because by picking web components, you are picking something that will not disappear at any time soon. And we've seen that frameworks come and go. And sure, I'm not suggesting that, say, React disappears from the internet tomorrow at all, but we know frameworks come and go. We know that the web platform kind of that underpins all that stays around. And also, that the web platform is backwards compatible by default. And so that this isn't going to be pulled out from under your feet anytime soon. So I think there's a lot of interesting pros, and there are definitely cons as well. I'm not here to fully advocate web components without acknowledging the cons when we can get into them. I think it's really interesting to think about using stuff that's baked more into the browser without paying that cost of a big additional lump of JavaScript.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom, go on, Dave.
No, I was just going to add to that. I fully agree. I mean, it's a great point of the fact that even if web components kind of stopped like this second, that it would still exist and it would still be maintained, because as Jack said, it's got to be backwards compatible, and it's got to stay alive. So if it was to stop now, then we've had a good run, but it still works pretty well, and the compatibility is pretty solid. And to go back to the points about for the use cases, absolutely, it shouldn't be used for every which way you want to use it. There is benefits and drawbacks. I said the other day, I was thinking, oh, maybe I could do my own website in web components. And I'm like, why? Well, why would I do that? Because it's static. It's pretty much read only. I want to make it as available as possible. I don't want it to be a heavy duty application. And it doesn't need to be distributed everywhere, like what we were talking about with our design system and being all over the place. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess as well. So, I mean, as you were talking, Jack, it made me think. I think perhaps one of the ways I was imagining I might reach for web components is actually something more akin to like templating, but really that's probably not appropriate because we have markup that is fine for those kind of things. But really, if you're going to be adding something that I imagine is a little bit more interactive, that maybe you would then be using JavaScript for, then this is a sensible way to encapsulate that. Now, is that too broad of a sweeping statement for a generalization of when is a good time to reach for web components and not? So, I mean, actually thinking about it, Dave, I mean, in the Nordhealth component library, are most of those components, do they have some form of interactivity, or are you also using this as ways to kind of encapsulate, you know, structure and style and other things as well?
Yeah, pretty much all the components that we've built have like some level of interaction, but we do have a couple that are for more presentational and structural type stuff. I mean, it's not to say that like they're like purely presentational. I mean, there's one component called a stack component that literally kind of lets us lay out stuff side by side or vertically, but it creates like a source order, and that has some level of semantics, and that's good for like creating like an accessible structure. But we in some of those cases we do provide like CSS helpers and things if it's going to be structural, because we don't want to like create the components too deep. But at the same time, like recently I did like the tab components as part of our design system, and that kind of warranted more complex stuff, so we can get in there and be a bit more complex with things. So I keep comparing web components to like details and summary components, or elements I should say, is that they came with their pairs, and they're not just like where you can put divs and stuff in there, but they were like particular elements, and that means that like stuff is quite tied together, and it means that like as they evolve or as they get added to, they stay together, rather than what I'm trying to say is that we can get in there and we can get involved again when we want to be more complex with the component, rather than just being like rudimentary like elements. But we've done pretty much everything, because it's interactive stuff. Like we've got drop downs, and we've got tabs, and we've got like modals and all of that kind of stuff. And it's been really good for like encapsulation and some other stuff, but I won't ramble.
We like the rambling, no worries. Cool. So I guess I do want to put one kind of fear of mine to bed, and that is about progressive enhancement, which I think is due a proper comeback and should be printed on t-shirts and have conferences about it. But I'm a big fan of progressive enhancement, and so one of the questions I had about web components is that, I mean, JavaScript is a dependency, right? But is there a progressive enhancement kind of story for web components, and can they be built in a way that are kind of progressive enhancements at their core, or is that hard?
I think it's hard. I think it's possible. So on my blog, for example, I wrote an article a while ago comparing Svelte and React, and so what I wanted to do is have code samples like side by side or on my blog. And I built a component that let you do that, or let you view one and toggle between them with a couple of tabs. And the way I do that is I have the web component that I've built, and I put the source code in as a child of that. So if you don't get that web component, if it doesn't load, the blog post will show the two code samples, one above the other, and that's all you get.
Right.
If the JavaScript does load and it all runs okay, it will then transform itself into like a nice tabbable interface to tab between the two. Okay. So for me, that's kind of spot on progressive enhancement, in that if it doesn't work, you don't miss out on anything. If you do, you just get a slightly nicer UI to toggle between them. So I think it's definitely possible. I think there are things that would make it more easy, especially when we start to talk about the Shadow Dom a bit more, because currently that is harder to do, and there are some considerations. There's a spec called the Declarative Shadow Dom, which I confess I hadn't heard of until a couple of days ago properly. And so there's work here to make it easier, but it is certainly possible, I think.
I mean, so often it comes down to how you choose to build the things it's not just about the tools, it's the way you approach it as well, isn't it? Because it feels like quite a lot of people have kind of thrown progressive enhancement in the bin as an approach because well, the framework will do the thing and I'll just do everything framework way. But that's maybe that's another whole different conversation. Maybe that I'll before I get into that. But fair enough. I mean, I suppose really, I mean, browsers do inherently like ignore tag elements that they don't understand, right? Or they default to treating them, you know, just as a block element if they don't understand them. So I guess we're safe in creating some exotic sounding element that has some behavior and just letting the browser fall back the way that it should, and then it's down to how we build stuff on top of it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Sorry, I think my dog is barking at someone that walked past the door. So excuse me if there's barking.
I thought they had opinions then. I thought
exactly.
The dog's getting involved.
I was being corrected by your dog.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right in that it's about how you approach it and how you hold it. Like my motivation with starting to talk about web components more is to get people when they're thinking about, do I need, as I said, a React, Vue, Angular, etc., to like slot web components in there as a viable option for a lot of cases. So I think it's not we should build everything in web components. There are times where if you're reaching for something, web components is a pretty valid option. And also I believe, as I think Nick has just put in the chat, web components can be used within most of those frameworks, if not all of them. I know React, I think, has support experimentally. I'm not quite up to date on the latest.
No, that's right.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, that's what we've got. But we've got like a little like wrapper like library to help us like translate some of our components. So we're still writing our components in with lit, but then we have like a little package to like help wrap up those components to be used in React. But we're hoping that like, you know, we can just remove that as a dependency. But yeah, you're right.
So Dave, maybe that's a good moment to like transition into talking a little bit about how you're building stuff at Nord. I mean, you mentioned lit there, and we haven't really spoken too much about that. What does lit give you? How does that help your kind of development with web components? Can you give us a bit of an overview of that?
So we use lit, and we use that inside or alongside TypeScript. So we're writing all our components in TypeScript, and the benefit of that is that we can kind of type check our stuff, but mostly so we have like a little bit of a cleaner API for a developer experience. We have like quite a large development team, and we have quite a large suite of like products where they need to be able to use these components just as is and be able to understand like the options and stuff like that. So you kind of get that inside your, you know, VS Code editor experience and what have you. So you put the component in and it starts telling you how to use it. And we use a bunch of other things as well to be able to document those. This is why web components works quite well as part of a design system, well, especially with lit, is that we can apply these little like decorators and things like that to produce basically a component API for like documentation and like explaining like all the little aspects of it. We talk about it on Twitter quite a bit, and we've been asked like, oh, do you use Storybook and things like that? And we're like, no, we just like have we just kind of produce this API and then we consume it with other things. Like our documentation is built with 11t, so all that kind of data comes through. So to go back to your point, we use lit for that, and we use lit for kind of it's quite similar to how you would build like a React component. There's all the like methods and like you've got your rendering and things like that. Forgive me for sounding dumber, but I'm like more front end than.
This is why I was particularly keen to have like the two of you both on, because Dave, you're building with this stuff and building it for a particular use case, and it's serving a particular need for you. And then Jack is using them in a slightly different context and a slightly different environment, so probably has some different perspectives. So this is exactly what I was hoping for. Because as someone who has never written a web component, but is a fan of kind of things like design systems and component libraries, and wishes that I really wish that I'd had insight into this when I was working at an agency, thinking about building out some of these resources for development teams to use over and over again. I really like hearing the use case for it. So it's good stuff, I think.
It's a similar angle to myself, because I worked on like design systems and parts of them, shall we say, like before properly working on this design system at Nordhealth, and I was, very much interested in building out these components and how we would do it, and this method of doing it seems to make sense, the most sense for us, because fairly recently there was discussions on what we would be using for X front end in one of our products, and we hadn't even made the decision, but we'd already made the decision to use web components. But that was great, because it means that whatever we use, whether that, say if we use like Nuxt or Next or something like that, like it doesn't really like matter, because the components would just kind of drop straight in, and with a little bit of manipulation you can use them however you so wish. We would like to use them as like part of the actual design system itself, like we bid the actual documentation, but that's more like a read-only site, so we're kind of doing it more statically and just enriching it with little bits of JavaScript, so that's a little bit more progressive enhanced. But in terms of our applications, it's they're not going to do very much without JavaScript being there, so that's why we do things like we use some CSS to hide the components until they are like rendered as like an actual registered component in the browser. So yeah, but we use a lot of like pretty regular like CSS, which is another like really great benefit. Like don't have to like write like a JavaScript object or something really like exotic. Like I'm just writing like normal CSS. I'm gonna pause, because I've got some stuff to talk about the CSS part of it, which I think is really like super interesting. But I'll let Jack comment, because I feel like I'm talking too much.
We'll definitely get on to talking about how you write CSS with it as well, because I know that Manuel, for instance, had some questions about that he kind of put on Twitter, so it'd be great to kind of loop back to that. But I would like to, as we're kind of chatting, pick up on something that Dion put in the chat as well about, and maybe Jack, this is something you could talk about, because I've seen quite a few of your talks over the years, and quite a few of them have been, this is how we moved this entire product from this stack over to this stack. I've seen you gonna go from Angular to React to goodness knows what. So with your kind of migrating from one to another hat on, Dion was asking, he's about to scroll off the screen. Have you been working with React components one day, and then you're kind of thinking, well, we'll move across to web components? Are there any big hurdles or gotchas, or does it feel like there's a kind of a natural flow of, we were thinking about componentizing this way, and now we're going to do them with web components? Is that a natural path, or are there any particular hurdles doing that?
I think there is more of a natural path than maybe people imagine there to be. I think sometimes people think it's this huge leap, and actually I don't think it's that different. And I think it is different. Say you wanted to pick just web components, no other library or framework at all, so no lit or anything, then that is a bigger leap, because you don't have the JSX style of declaring your DOM and having something decide when to re-render and update it, by and large, without you really having to care about it. So that is why something like lit is a great tool. Or we use one level below lit, which is called lit HTML, which is really just the templating and efficient rendering part. The thing that I think people seem to have to get used to is getting used to using more platform primitives. So what I mean by that is being comfortable like creating custom events in the browser and dispatching those events, and using just the built-in default add event listener to listen to things, or lit has syntax to sort of listen to those things. The thing that I've found with using web components and lit HTML is you have to do a bit more manual work. You don't get as much out of the box. So in React, you declare some state, you write some code, you write, set new state 2, and then React decides, I need to re-render now, and I'll update the DOM to show that. Now, lit will do that for you, but at the level I'm more experienced at with lit HTML is I haven't used lit too much, so I will let Dave sort of talk more about lit, and I don't want to say things that are incorrect. And I think Justin, who works on lit, is in the chat, so he can jump in and tell me when I'm wrong.
Excellent. Yeah.
But with lit HTML, you have to tell it like, okay, hey, I've changed something. Please, can you re-render? And that is quite a big leap for people to go from the framework deciding when to re-render and really controlling that, to you actually having control. And what that means is you have to remember to call these particular functions to get the stuff to update. But what we found is that you then have full control over exactly what the component does when, and not kind of giving up that control to a framework can be quite powerful for times when you need to step like slightly off the beaten path, right? So, things like React and Vue, any of these frameworks that fully control the rendering cycle, 99% of the time, that's great. And you never need to do something weird. But just every now and then you've got some UI or some browser bug you need to fix, or something that just, if only you could like stop React doing it and you could just kind of walk around the wall or kind of step aside for a sec.
Yeah.
And I think if you do use sort of closer to like raw, if you like, web components, you get to do that more easily. And so I've, for a very much a personal perspective, I've found that really freeing in that we have full control over exactly how my components operate at all times.
Yeah.
So that for me is the big change. I think if people were to like look at the DevTools code base, and I can find a link to an example component because a lot of it is open source. You would see a lot of like manual calls to a render method and things that would be odd or feel alien if you've spent a lot of time working in a framework like React.
This appeals to me a great deal because okay, so since it's just us and it's the circle of trust, I never really got into React. Don't tell the internet because they'll all come for me. Everyone on the internet will come for me. I love the fact that it brings you all of these utilities and this a fast track to being able to do a lot of the things that are really arduous doing manually. However, I also am kind of a bit more used to probably building things that aren't as complex in terms of a rich application. I've been building lots of stuff around the web for a long time that doesn't need all of that. So I like the fact that I can just be a bit closer to the platform and just use, things that are a bit simpler and just have much more control. And it feels like in that way I can ship just what I need and nothing more. And also it's maybe it's also because I'm lazy and I didn't want to learn another framework again and again. But sorry, go on, Dave. What are you going to say?
No, it's okay. There's another aspect of just like what you're familiar with, and I'm very much familiar with like vanilla JavaScript because I'll just be like, I'll do my front end, and then I'll be like, I just want to apply a little bit of extra interactivity, and I like either want to do that with a bit of CSS and like state change and stuff like that, and I'm just so used to doing document query selector and all that kind of like quote unquote the normal stuff like in when. And I've done a few React projects in the past, like, and I felt it to be like it just gets further and further away from like a typical expected like API, and I much prefer what we're doing in our design system as like with Lit, because even with using the entirety of Lit, we still use stuff like query selector and like doing little like attribute changes and things like that. It never feels like too exotic. Like I feel like I could take a couple of lines out of our code base and just plant that into like CodePen and it would still do the same thing because it's so similar. And again, with the CSS, it's the same deal. It feels very like similar because it is the same thing. Like when we write CSS for our components, where instead of writing :root for the top level element, we wrote :host, which is like that's the top level like Shadow Dom element that we apply all our stuff to, and then within there we have all our elements, and you do like .button or .whatever and like all those kind of elements, but it's all encapsulated in there. And one of the things that we really like doing, and we need to like write about this more and probably document it a bit better, is that we use a lot of CSS custom properties, which kind of opens up web components as like a custom like CSS API. So you can't by default like apply CSS directly into. All right,
Dog doesn't agree.
No,
yes on you.
No, they want me to use style components and nothing else. That's what they're saying. So what we do is we create like set of like CSS custom properties on like the host selector, and what that means is that when somebody uses that web component, they can apply CSS that trickles inside of the component itself. So say you've got like I don't know, like a card component, and you wanted to change something like the header color, text color. So we could do header text color, it was like dash dash header text color, and then apply that color directly there. And that will only affect what the developer of that component has allowed it to do. And that works really well for us, because then we can kind of restrict things, and we can even manipulate and steer stuff into other directions. And it kind of locks stuff down, keeps style encapsulated, but at the same time we can still, you know, benefit from inheritance. So we just open it up where we want to, but keep stuff locked down. And that's not to like stop people being able to do what they want to do, but it just prevents stuff from breaking so easily. So yeah,
nice. Westbrook's in the chat and giving a big +1 to CSS as a component API, and I know that Westbrook's one of the folks who kind of instigated this this kind of call happening, and
yes.
I know works at Adobe building out a large kind of component library and style library, component library there. So probably is tackling some similar challenges to what you've been talking about.
Oh, I would say so, because we keep looking at. I think we're
right.
stuff. I'm like, oh, how do I do drop down? Like, oh, how is Adobe doing drop downs?
Nice. So the so some of the utilities that Jack was kind of mentioning about, you know, things that are done for you with a framework such as React, you know, for, you know, maybe event handling or kind of managing state or anything like that. But I suppose particularly event handling. Is that the kind of thing that you get from Lit? Then that's the kind of functionality that Lit versus Lit HTML. So forgive me, I'm pretending to be really ignorant on this call for the sake of explanations coming. So Lit HTML wouldn't necessarily have that, but Lit is a library that would then provide those kind of utilities. Am I getting that correct?
Okay. They overlap in that area. So, you know, so in React, I can't quite remember the React syntax in JSX, but something like click equals, you know, curly braces, this dot on click or whatever. Lit and Lit HTML, like Lit HTML lets you declare the HTML that component will render. That has a similar syntax. So in Lit HTML, you would do at click equals, you know, this dot on click. So it's almost, it looks exactly kind of the same. And that's what I was talking about earlier. People who move, say, from React to that world, in their heads, it's a huge leap. And then actually you build a Lit component, like, oh, this is actually very familiar to me. So that they are pretty close in that regard. There are some ways in which they differ, but in that regard, I think it would look more similar than you might imagine.
And even more so if you were somebody who's used like Vue a bit more. That's a little bit more like structure to it. But again, you don't have to use like the at click. You can still do like event listeners and stuff like that, and we do that all the time, and we'll fire off events to like do state changes and stuff. I just seen in the chat about using elements as like part of the children, and it's like that's one of the like key things to do, and that's what we do as part of our web components, is that we have slots. So slots are like what they sound like. They are where you slot in different bits of HTML, and by default you can do just slot, like a slot like tag, and that will fill in all the elements that you're putting inside the web component. So between the two tags, the opening and closing ones. But you can also do named slots. So you can say, right, well, this goes into the header, this goes into the footer, this goes into, we're using syntax that's like using like logical properties kind of style. So what we do is we do start and end. So we don't do top and bottom or like header and footer. We kind of try and do start and end. So say, for example, a button, and we wanted to put an icon in it. So we would put an icon at the start. So for left to right language, it would be on the left, and, you know, flipped for right to left. But that means that we can kind of slot in icons. We can slot in, like we've got stuff for like for the tabs. I made it so you can actually just slot anything in there, really. So we can eventually at some point create tabs that are kind of open and closable, just like tabs in like the browser. But slots are really like powerful, and you can kind of create like a whole like templating structure in there, as well as like being able to just put like attributes. I keep calling them options. I need to know what the actual like syntax is for Lit, but I just keep calling them options or attributes because they are like HTML attributes. So we do stuff like make up new ones like open on our custom web components, or we'll do stuff like using like ARIA stuff. Like we'll just use the regular ARIA stuff because that's already part of the spec. That's like
Right.
semantic. And then we'll hook into that. Like, for example, we've got a pop out component, and that uses ARIA pop-up when we kind of like point to different elements on the page, and that already gives us like all the semantic structure and all the benefit and like the accessible stuff. But then we can also hook into that and like do like DOM manipulation, or like changing state and like opening things up and animating them and all that malarkey.
Nice. You've you kind of struck on another thing that I'm curious about as well. When you start talking about kind of ARIA attributes, the HTML that's included inside a web component, if it's elements in there that aren't kind of custom elements that you're creating, if you're just using regular HTML elements, existing HTML elements, does the browser just treat those the same way that it does elements that are outside of your custom element? So in other words, do you just get all of the benefits of the platform and the browser that already exists, so that you don't have to reimagine selects and options and those kind of things? Is that correct?
Yes.
Just yes. Like me and Jack were just both nodding. It's like it's just the same. Like the only thing is like I recently kind of dawned on me that it's kind of isolated, which is pretty like cool in terms of like if you're using identifiers and kind of pointing to things inside your component. So say you've got a button and it's saying it's pointing to another element that's within that component, you can say ID equals, I don't know, pop-up or something that's inside that web component. And you'd think, oh no, well, what if someone uses pop-out on the page? It's like, well, it doesn't matter because it's inside Shadow Dom. It's like, It's isolated. It's a one-to-one thing. Problem is you can't, it makes it a bit difficult when you want to go outside, when you're like leaking out and trying to get out there. But, you still got the kind of typical like JavaScript stuff to be able to like manipulate things. And we do that all the time for like kind of creating. Again, the tabs have got like accessible IDs, which means that we can kind of reference stuff outside of itself to reach out and kind of make relationships between those elements. But it's all the same stuff, like ARIA stuff that kind of gets all read out and everything that we use. Like for another example is our Nord input component. Unsurprisingly, there's an input component in there, like an input element, just a normal like input element, and we just do some extra like bits and bobs to kind of add labels and hints and all of that kind of stuff. And we still use like we're still using required to like say if the input is required and you have to fill it in. So all the kind of normal stuff.
Oh, I like that. So I hadn't really thought about that, but just as a way of enforcing good practices on the HTML that people would be writing otherwise, it feels like it's a sensible route for that as well, because you can like enforce that people put these correct attributes on there, and you, or some of that you're doing automagically because
that's kind of again like while we're using TypeScript is that we kind of force people to like, and I put little like warning errors and stuff like that inside of our components, like for using the right ARIA attributes. Like again, I keep going on about the tab stuff, but I spent like weeks and weeks doing those tab components, and it's like it's still like imprinted in my brain. And there's an example where you have to apply an ARIA label to the like containing like tab list, because when you tab through it, if you can't see what's there in the thing, you don't really know what that tab list is referenced to. So you need to put a label to make it like semantic and more accessible. So what we've done is like I've put some code in there to say a little warning will come up in the console to say you need to put a label on this, and then you just put label equals whatever, and then that gets passed down as an ARIA labeled by whatever, and then kind of put the value directly in there.
Nice. Is it very complicated to use different web components together? I mean, like nesting them, having them talking to each other, those kind of things. Are there particular gotchas there, or does it? I'm scared of using the expression "just work," but how smooth is that? Or is that a big pain point, or is it okay?
I don't think it's a pain point. I think a lot of it works as you would expect. I think the one area that can be an issue is if you're using Shadow Dom to get that kind of encapsulation, then, if you're inside one component in its own Shadow Dom, it can be hard to reach out well, it's by design, I should point out, like
Right.
it deliberately is made very tricky for you to get out and pull things out of that Shadow DOM. And that's typically a good thing. So you do have to think about it. The way we do it is if you've got web component A that renders web component B, you know, the parent can pass data in via attributes or properties, and then the inner component can dispatch events to send data back up the DOM tree. And what's really nice about that, very similar, if anyone is here as like a React developer, you've got like pass properties down, and then you pass like callback properties down, which the React components will call to let their parents know that stuff has happened. That's really what we're doing, but we're doing it with web components and crucially like browser native events. So we're sending the same kind of events that you send when your user hits form and you get a submit event. Well, you can send your own events from your component using the built-in API called dispatch event. So it does, again, if you're comparing it to like the same in React, it feels surprisingly similar and does kind of just work. Famous
Nice.
last words. But a lot of the time it does, which is really nice.
Cool. I'm going to just refer to the chat for a second, if that's okay, because Oliver, hey Oliver, mentioned one of the questions that Manuel put on Twitter about, and Dave, I know you touched on this very briefly, just about how you kind of scope and write your CSS. But there's a question about can you use Sass and SCSS with web components, or is that something that's just kind of upstream in the build tooling, or do you need to use Sass?
I personally, I don't think you need to use Sass, but then I don't want to upset anybody because I like Sass. I like using it. I'm still using it for my own website, but at the same time, like the CSS right now is like pretty damn good. Like just out of the box, like we got like CSS Custom Properties. We've got like selectors that can do all sorts of, like even like the good old like attribute selectors with the square brackets and saying like we've got like the button component and we say square brackets like variant equals primary. So like the primary button, we apply like special colors to that, or like highlighted colors, I should say. So I mean, that being said, we're leveraging that because we have our own like tokens and a whole like design system. So what we've got is we've got a series of tokens that are like all written in YAML, and then we get that built out into various different tool sets. So we do produce like a Sass like list of key value pairs, but we also do CSS Custom Properties. So we produce that as a whole list, and they all like get built out, and then we use that package as part of our component system, and then we bring that in as styles, and those get kind of trickled in as part of it, and then we repurpose them inside the component and say, right, we want to use that color there, we want to use this accent color here, or like shadows and like border radius and all of that kind of stuff. So we make like real heavy use of CSS Custom Properties, as well as like just like using normal CSS, and then we like put that straight into lit. I guess lit's kind of helping us along there by saying, here's the styles, and we kind of give it, I think we give it an array. So we give it like our like one of our default like CSS that we just do out of the box, like for like when the component gets defined, so it renders and shows up. And if it doesn't render, we hide it because it's not going to be very useful without JavaScript, or it's not going to be very useful without it being actually defined in the browser. And then we apply the styles for that component, and that comes with all the kind of extra stuff. And we can even like style like slotted elements inside of it. So another example is our navigation components. Like we are setting some additional styles to the navigation like items within it to like help with focus rings and things like that, just so we get it like in context. But then when we present those components outside of context in the kind of isolation, when we do it in the docs, you don't get those extra styles. So it's kind of, we can be contextual, but we can also be like completely like isolated. Are we using part? I think we are using part. I can't recall what that what part is. I'm just sorry. I'm looking in the
Yeah, I was looking at that
questions.
as well. Yeah, I was curious.
You'll have to like remind me, Westbrook. I can't remember the part. I think we might be using part. We use we use like slotted a lot, like just using like slotted elements, and you can just like select the element that's been slotted as part of it. So anytime that gets put in there, like another example would be like a navigation. If you wanted to do spacing, like if you just had the navigation items is like spaced out in between each other, like using flex gap, we don't really want to have flex gap like outside of it or margins outside of it. We want them to just be inside of it. So when we have our design system, those elements in isolation, you don't get like weird like margin around the edge. You get like the pure kind of component edge to edge.
Got you.
Yeah, if I could be slightly tongue-in-cheek as well and rephrase the initial question of CSS and components, I think you could rephrase it as, can you use Sass in the browser? And I don't mean that like really sarcastically, but I think that's kind of the like mind shift that I see people thinking about, is like, can I do this in web components? Can I do this in? And it's like, it's just the same as, can you do it with anything? They just happen to be built in. So yeah, you can use whichever form of CSS you want. You just need to get it into eventually an end state that the browser understands, and then away you go. And you know, the shadow DOM and the encapsulation we talk about, for me, I think that's a big pro point and good benefit of using web components. It's just worth noting that you don't have to lean into that if you don't want to. You can use custom elements without shadow DOM. I personally wouldn't recommend it, but it is a thing you can do if you don't want to deal with some of those issues, which can be a nice kind of transition path into using them first without going kind of full fat all in.
Full fat all in.
Yeah. I just had to go and check about the part like selector. I think that so I think Westbrook's saying that the element part could be the attribute, and then you can have full control of the element outside. Full control from outside of the element. So I think we might be intentionally not doing that because we don't want our developers to like kind of go like hell for leather and be able to control the full thing. But there may be cases where we want to do that, where we want like the element within there to have full kind of CSS styling, but we're trying to like provide like guardrails in our design system. So it produces a consistent UI, and nobody has to like think about, oh no, is that going to be the wrong red, or is that going to like not have good contrast? You're like, well, you don't have to worry about that because it's just going to be fine out of the box. Oh, and thanks for the compliment, Joe, for the docs.
Yeah, great. So this reminded me of something that I felt my world was turned upside down a tiny bit recently at Smashing Conf in San Francisco, where Harry Roberts was giving a talk about various aspects of optimizing performance in the browser. And one of the things that he kind of was leaning into was including style tags in many places in the page, which I'd always thought was a massive no-no, but apparently not so much. And one of the things that I was thinking about, web components, is if the fact that we're kind of encapsulating these in various places within the DOM, and there's lots of places where style is being introduced in the DOM. My maybe slightly outdated instinct would have been, well, that's going to be declaring style at various places within the DOM that I thought was a bit of a no-no for performance. So have browsers just moved? Am I just behind the times and browsers are better at dealing with that kind of stuff now? Or is it just so marginal that it doesn't really matter? Am I worrying unnecessarily about that?
I think it might fall a little bit into the realm of premature optimization, but I can imagine it being an issue. But if you think about Shadow DOM and the fact that those styles, so when you have a Shadow DOM and you put styles in there, they are only scoped to that Shadow DOM. They cannot affect anything else outside of that. And so that means that it's less intensive because the browser doesn't have to take those styles that it's just found and immediately think if it needs to be applied. I mean,
repaint everything.
I should caveat that I'm not a browser engineer, and so I'm horrendously oversimplifying what happens, and I don't even know what happens.
I tweeted it. I already tweeted it.
But you know, so it's not quite as much work as you might imagine. There's also a really interesting proposal called, well, not proposal, I think it's landed in Chrome, called Constructable Style Sheets. I don't know what the cross-browser support here is. One of the benefits of working on Chrome DevTools is I only have to think about one browser's support for it. But constructible style sheets let you have this style sheet object with all the styles in, and then you can pass those into various shadow DOMs. So you don't have to duplicate the same styles across 4 different shadow DOMs. You have this style sheet object, which the browser can then obviously pass once and cache, and then it gets passed into the various places that you need it. So we moved to this because we had, say, let's take a button component, and I don't know, imagine a page with 20 buttons on. Firstly, we should probably redesign that page. But what we at first, each of those components, each button would have its own shadow DOM, and each shadow DOM would have a style tag with those styles inside, and that worked. And we didn't change it because we were hitting performance issues with that. We weren't. But now what we do is we have one constructible style sheet, which then is given to all the instances of the button components. So they're really, really great new addition. I say I don't know the full browser support or where they are in the spec wise, so I'd have to look that up. But also we then move on to, I think they're called import assertions. And this is broadly a way of being able to use JavaScript or ES module imports, but to import file types that aren't JavaScript and have the browser be able to understand that and know what they do. And so suddenly we're getting to the realm where, 5 years ago, you would do import styles from styles.css and you'd hook up your various Webpack plugins to make that work. And it would be like a configuration nightmare. And then what would actually happen is your CSS would get random hashes added to the classes. So they acted like they were unique, but they weren't really, they were just hashed. But now we're getting to the world where in the browser, you can do import styles from styles.css. Then you take that styles, you pass it into a shadow DOM, and that's it. And it just works. So I think I'm really looking forward to kind of where we're going to get with some of this stuff. As I said, I'm kind of lucky that I can use some of it a bit ahead of others because cross-browser support isn't something that I have to worry about day to day. It's a lovely place to be. But
meanwhile,
so it will take a while for it to be kind of stable and out and something we can all lean on all the time. But I can find a link to an article on constructible style sheets because they're really, really powerful.
I'd have to have a look at that. That sounds really good because at the minute for us, we're kind of, it's not rudimentary. We're just using it kind of style straight up in each of the components. But we also have like a minified like CSS framework library that we bring in old fashioned like link tag at the top, and then that kind of trickles down with the kind of main styles, and it should kind of catch all things at least a little bit. And then for particular elements, but the other thing is like if that for us, if that element doesn't get that component, that component doesn't get used on the page, then we're not rendering any of those styles, and the page is going to be pretty lean. We're only doing like what we need to, which is it, or adding what we need to. So I think that's one of the things that like people who like use React and kind of maybe style components and stuff, they're quite keen to be constantly like tree shaking or like kind of keeping stuff very like lean, and we've achieved that. But yeah, you do get like ever so slight like duplication, but then I think it's quite a diminished returns. Like it's going to get quite reduced down there. But I'd be interested on those constructible style sheets.
Okay, I've just glanced up at the clock, and just before we started this, Jack complimented me on making sure that we scheduled this for a Friday, end of work day on Friday, on a lovely sunny day in the UK, clashing with Wimbledon, where there's interest for people from the UK. Brilliant. So nailed that. But before we wrap up, maybe can we kind of summarize a tiny bit? Do you think? If we hadn't taken an entire hour to kind of chat about this and share it, and if I just bumped into the two of you in the pub and I said, I'm thinking about starting to use web components, what maybe from both of you would be the, this is why it's great and why I like it, but be careful of. Do you have something that fits into both of those things, or what would be the thing that you enjoy most about using web components if you were trying to advocate for them for me?
I'd say you get the first round to begin with.
I mean, that's
and the second.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jack. You go first with the.
So I'd encourage everyone to give them a go. As kind of the underlying theme for me is kind of this. I don't love the phrase like use the platform, but I do think browsers have come a long way and they are a lot more powerful than they were a few years ago in terms of components and building from components. And that's unsurprising because what we typically see is frameworks and libraries come along that popularize for good reason a certain way of working. Then over time, those kind of trickle into natively being in the browser. Classic example, query selector, all pretty much came, carbon copy from jQuery and the like. Yeah. And so it's unsurprising to me we're now at the point where these behaviors that React, Vue, et cetera, popularized are now something we can reach for with native browser kind of things that come built in. And so I think that's really powerful. I've also personally really enjoyed learning more about the platform and the things that are built into the browser that I don't have to reach for third-party tools. Right. I wrote a blog post on this recently. Like I built a side project just using web components, and I was able to validate all my inputs using the HTML required tags. There's even an API now to customize how they look and style. And so I think there is a lot of really, really good stuff coming to the browser. And I think it's always good to try something else. I'm not here saying everyone should use web components straight away, but I think it's just interesting to try something that's in the browser, see what it's like, how it compares to React or whatever it is you're familiar with. So if we were in the pub, I'd be very much encouraging you to give it a go. I don't think it will be immediately seamless, but I think it will be a good experience. And what I'm hopeful of is getting to the point where people can seriously consider web components for their next thing. And that doesn't have to be the next big work project that you're betting your career on. It could just be a side project that you want to build, or a small internal tool at work, or something. Because I think a lot of people, if you could convince them to give it a go, would be pleasantly surprised at how equivalent to the sort of React types it is. And I don't have anything too negative to say. I think there are some missing gaps that will be filled in over time. I think the server-side rendering story is probably one that a lot of people look at right now as being less ahead of time. Again, unsurprising to me because there's almost a lag on browsers figuring out what to do as things get popularized. I think that will come. I think there are things like the Declarative Shadow Dom to sort of come in there. But I think it's really exciting technology that we have in the browser without having to ask users to download X kilobytes of JavaScript. I think that's a big win.
Nice. I like it. Dave, anything to
add?
I
mean, coming from a bit more perspective of like the whole design system that we're building, I think it's absolutely a serious consideration for building out components when you need to use them in more applications in various different situations. I think I've seen the benefits. I don't want to sound like I've sipped too much Kool-Aid in the last 6 months or so in this new job, but I do feel like it works extremely well. That being said, we've built it in such a way where we've kept things lean, and I think that's important to do that regardless of what tooling you go with. But this has worked really well for us, and we're kind of seeing the benefits just because of how versatile and how easy it is to put into different contexts. We just, in our documentation, is static. We just drop them in. We don't even do anything particularly clever. They just appear on the page. And to add about server side stuff and the drawbacks to maybe, what about this complex component that I built? What's going to happen if there's no JavaScript, or if nothing's going to be there to render it at the other end? Let's not forget that like we were talking about with slots, the whole contents of that component can be spat out and will be spat out if nothing happens. You can just show it there unless you put some CSS to hide it. For example, there is Zach Leatherman's details summary kind of library. I'll have to find a link for that. And that kind of enriches the details summary elements to do a lot more clever stuff. But inside of that, the details and summary is still there. So if nothing happens, you still get details and summary, and you still can toggle and use the platform as is. But I've talked to a number of people, and they I think they see the benefits from outside looking in on our design system, and I think if you're like starting something up that's going to be quite large scale and you need to appeal to like all sorts of different developers or all sorts of different stakeholders, I would absolutely like consider web components and ergo lit if you wanted to go down that route, because people like me who haven't got like the most experience with like JavaScript, but more like front of the front as they call it with CSS and HTML, lit will be a lot more comfortable, I would say. I've certainly felt a bit more comfortable doing that. So
nice.
Yeah,
brilliant. Well, thank you both so much. I'm certainly convinced that I want to have a dabble. I feel like I know much more now than I did before, and I should also thank everyone who kind of joined and chimed in on the chat, and also kind of nudged us towards having the conversation this way, because it's nice to have a chat outside of 104. No, what is it? I was about to say 140 character limit. Oh,
for your age.
Oh, Phil. Can I add one more tiny thing I forgot before we end? Is that bad? I think also there's a big longevity story to components.
Right.
So if you're working on a tool that or a web, whatever that's you think will be around for a long time, then I think web components that's a huge plus for them. And I often think about that in the context of DevTools. You know, I can't Chrome DevTools or DevTools in its initial incarnation, 10, 15 years ago, at least, when those started to be in browsers. And if the developers who built Chrome DevTools then had picked Backbone JS, maybe whatever was popular 10 years ago, I wouldn't be having such a fun time now, sort of trying to work through that. So the longevity story is also, I think, a big plus point and worth considering.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good one. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you both very much. I'm very grateful that you spent an hour of your Friday early evening locked in a hot room with the windows and the doors closed so that you could be on a microphone. It's I'm very grateful. And I guess we'll wrap it up now. I have put a few links. Oh, look at me doing a YouTube-y thing. I have put some links down in the description. Oh,
smash that
like and subscribe.
Oh, it's a short hop from here to being an influencer. Loving it. But yeah, thanks so much to both of you for sparing the time, and I'll look forward to chatting with you more about this as I kind of dig in myself a bit more. And hopefully see you in real life soon as well.
Yeah, maybe I'd love to do this in like 3 months when you've built something with some web components.
Start the
how you found it.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I like that.
That's a good idea. Let's do that. We'll come back in approximately 3 months.
No, exactly 3 months.
3 months to the day, and I'll report back my progress.
Just set a reminder.
No, I'm sold on that. That's a good idea. Awesome. All right. Thanks so much. I'll let you both go, and thanks everyone. And yeah, we'll share more links in the description, and see you all around the internet. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone.
See ya. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Okay. I think.